I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule, they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. In the middle of my first night at the old abandoned power station, I was drenched in an oppressive feeling, as if something was watching me from the darkness. This place was not just dead. It absorbed every sound, every shadow, every movement. It seemed as if the station itself was breathing. Its walls emitted soft crackles, as if trying to speak, but the sound was trapped inside the metal. The smokestacks jutted into the sky like charred bones, and huge hangars stretched into endless darkness. We had just entered, and I already wanted to leave. Outside, our Jeep was parked, dirty from the road and the layer of dust that had grown on its roof. Its dark silhouette looked like the last reminder of safety. Carl, the boss, kept pulling us along. "We'll check the main areas today, the rest in the morning." He spoke with such confidence, as if morning could actually come to this place. He quickly paced along the echoing concrete floor of the corridor. I didn't understand why we needed to rush, especially at night, to inspect this station. I understood that the corporation that hired us to inspect the station before buying were greedy bastards, but not to this extent. It seemed Carl wanted to escape from here as quickly as possible, as if someone was chasing him. My paranoia began to play up. I even sneakily looked back, but the corridor was empty. Martin walked alongside, silently, with an expression I knew all too well. He didn't speak, but his eyes scanned everything around like an animal cornered. Sometimes he looked over his shoulder, holding his gaze a little longer than usual, but he said nothing. I had known him for many years, and he was also uneasy here. Sophie looked out of place in this tomb-like silence. Her bright vest seemed to mock the gray desolation of the station. Her eyes widened as she looked at the huge turbines, rusty and motionless, as if frozen in anticipation. She quietly said, "It's like someone died here." Her voice broke the silence, but none of us responded. I had barely begun to understand what was bothering me when I heard the first sound. It was dry, like a finger snap, coming from behind, somewhere from the dark corridor. I turned around, but saw nothing but the endless black maw of the tunnel leading to the transformer rooms. Our steps slowed, each of us froze, listening. Only Carl, as if nothing had happened, continued forward, his silhouette dissolving in the dim light. "Did you hear that too?" Sophie whispered. I nodded, trying not to meet her eyes. When we reached the central hall, the air changed. It wasn't just the smell of coal and rust. There was something else, nauseating. The generators, of course, had long stopped, but there was something unusual about them. Martin froze, staring at them as if seeing an old enemy. "Nothing special, just an old station," Carl said, his voice as taut as a string. But he wasn't speaking to us. He was talking to himself. The warehouse was worse than I could have imagined. At first, it was just the traces, a thin layer of dust on the floor, disturbed as if someone had recently passed through. The door leading further in was locked with an old chain, but someone had clearly tried to tear it off. "Don't touch that," Carl snapped. But Sophie had already stepped forward, examining the scratches on the metal. "It looks like nail scratches," she said, her voice trembling. My throat tightened. I looked at the door, at the chain, at those scratches that swirled like random lines, but at the same time created a sense of someone desperately trying to get out. Carl abruptly pushed the door open. The room beyond was bathed in the dim light of emergency lamps. The air was icy, the cold penetrating through our clothes, making our teeth chatter. The walls of the room were covered in rust, and it seemed that in some places the metal was trying to shed its dead appearance. "This is it," Carl said, his voice almost reverent. "What is it?" I asked. "What we're here for," he replied without turning to me. But it wasn't that scared me. It was the quiet scraping that I heard at that moment. Scraping coming from deep within the station, from somewhere in the darkness, as if someone was slowly dragging a metal object across the floor. Martin was the first to move back. I wanted to do the same, but my gaze was fixed on the darkness. At that moment, the emergency lamp flickered. When it lit up again, there were new tracks on the floor. Tracks leading to the door, which closed behind us on its own. "Did you see that?" Sophie whispered. "No," I lied. The steps we heard as we returned to the car accompanied us all the way to the exit, but they were not our steps. The corridors were becoming narrower, the walls pressing in as if the station deliberately constricted the space around us. The light from our handheld flashlights seemed even weaker, and the air filled with a fine dust that scratched the throat with every breath. We moved in silence. Carl walked first, his steps quick, but not confident. Sophie followed him, clutching her notebook to her chest. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, and the shadow of her figure flitted across the walls like a frightened animal. I walked last, constantly looking back, though I knew it wouldn't help. "There it is," Carl said, stopping at a massive door, weathered by time. A heavy chain with a rusted lock that strangely looked newer than the rest of the door hung on it. Thin lines, either cracks or scratches made by something sharp, were visible on the metal surface. Sophie raised her flashlight, illuminating the sign above the door, Technical Section 4. The letters were almost erased, but still legible. Her breathing became erratic. I noticed her eyes linger on the chain, as if trying to decide whether the door was protecting something from us or us from something inside. Carl stepped closer, ran his hand over the metal, and I heard the crunch of his fingers scraping the rust. "It looks unusual," he said. His voice was muffled, but I detected a note of doubt. "Feels like someone was here recently. Do you want to open it?" Sophie tried to sound calm, but her voice quivered. Carl didn't answer. He stood looking at the door, as if weighing something. His hand reached for the chain, but paused in midair. It was just a fraction of a second, but I saw him flinch slightly, as if he felt something. "No," he finally said, his voice sharp as if he wanted to rid himself of the word as quickly as possible. "We don't touch it. If someone decided to lock this place up, they had a reason." His words had a strange effect. Instead of relief, I felt a new wave of anxiety wash over me. We stood before a door that seemed more than just a piece of metal. It was something that was watching us, and we were not here just to inspect. I looked around. The floor was covered with a thick layer of coal dust, but near the door, I noticed prints. Not clear, but still noticeable tracks that led directly to the chain. They were odd, too deep and unnaturally even, as if left not by a human, but something mechanical. I crouched down to look closer, but could make no sense of them. "What's this?" Sophie asked, noticing my focus. Her voice was tense. "I don't know," I honestly replied, "but they lead here." Carl abruptly straightened. "We're leaving," he declared. "There's nothing to search for here." Back to the central hall, we slowly began to move away from the door, but I still couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about it was wrong. It didn't just close off a room. It repelled us. I felt that something was waiting behind that door, and it knew we were here. As we returned to the central hall, I noticed Sophie constantly looking back. Her steps were uneven, and her flashlight moved faster, as if she feared the light might go out. Carl walked silently, not uttering a word. His back was tense, and his shoulders slightly hunched, like someone trying to avoid an observer's gaze. When we reached the hall, Carl stopped and looked back. His eyes met mine, and I saw not fear, but something else. Exhaustion, or maybe an attempt to hide what he knew, but didn't want to say. "Don't mention the section in the report," he finally said. "It doesn't matter." Sophie was about to object, but I stopped her with a look. This was not the time to argue. We returned to the table, leaving behind corridors where something, perhaps, still moved. But even sitting in the relative light of the central hall, I felt that Section 4 remained with us. Its door, its chain, its tracks, they were now part of us. The night enveloped the station unexpectedly, as if someone had cut the world off from light. Inside the hangar, darkness swallowed everything, leaving only an islet of dim light from a few flashlights. The air became thick, saturated with the smell of dust and rust. Every breath was laborious, as if the station itself resisted our presence. The nearest hotel, also abandoned and vacant, was about 30 kilometers away, and Carl had forbidden us from leaving the station. We settled in for the night in the central hall. An old metal table, a couple of folding chairs, and food. Our makeshift camp looked as dead as the place we were in. No one talked. Even Carl, usually so loud, was deep in his notes, avoiding our gazes. His face remained calm, but in the tense silence, You could hear him quietly tapping his fingers on the table. That was the only sound, apart from our breathing. Sophie sat next to me, curled up into a small ball. Her hands tightly held her notebook, but she didn't even try to make any notes. Her eyes wandered to the dark corners of the room where the light from our flashlights couldn't dispel the thick darkness. The silence seemed to thicken around us like water, plunging us into a deep abyss. Martin hardly moved. He sat upright, his gaze focused on the nearest corridor. His lips were tightly pressed together, and his hands lay on his knees, like a warrior ready to attack. His stillness was oppressive, but something in his posture suggested he was waiting for something to happen, and it did. Suddenly, in the thick silence, a sound emerged, barely perceptible, like the quiet scraping of metal on concrete. It came from the corridor leading into the depths of the station. The sound was wrong, alien, but not loud. It pierced the air like a whisper in the ear, making us all tense up. Martin was the first to stand. His movements were quick but not abrupt. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the corridor without a word. Sophie looked up, her eyes widening with fear. Carl glanced briefly at Martin but didn't stop him. I watched as his silhouette disappeared into the inky darkness. The flashlight he held barely penetrated it, leaving only a flickering spot of light that soon vanished. We were left sitting, surrounded by a silence that was now even more oppressive. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time seemed to stop, dissolving in the thickness of the darkness. No one moved. Even Carl, usually impatient, froze in place, as if afraid to provoke something with his movement. The sound returned. This time, it was steps. Dull, rhythmic, they echoed from the same corridor Martin had entered. The steps were slow, unsure. I felt my blood freeze. The sound was too heavy to be Martin, but too human not to seem familiar. Carl's flashlight snatched the corridor from darkness, but it was empty. The steps continued to approach, but left no traces. The air grew even colder. It felt as if the station itself was tightening around us, slowly but surely. And then everything went quiet. The silence was absolute. Even our breathing seemed too loud. I peered into the corridor, feeling the tension constrict my chest. An inner voice screamed in my head, "Run, Zrina," but I couldn't move. A sudden scream shattered the silence, piercing, filled with pain and despair. It echoed through the hall. It was Martin. His voice sounded as though he was being torn apart by something invisible. I jumped to my feet, but didn't know where to run. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a deafening emptiness. I ran to the corridor, holding the flashlight in front of me. Its weak light trembled with my hand, but I kept moving forward. The air in the corridor was dense and icy, like in a freezer. It seemed even the light was absorbed by the darkness, weakening with every step. I found him. Martin lay on the floor, his eyes open but his gaze frozen. His hands were clenched into fists, and his face was fixed in an expression of horror. I knelt beside him, trying to find a pulse, but his skin was cold as ice. Something about his posture was wrong, unnatural, as if all the bones in his body had been broken and twisted. Beside him on the concrete lay his flashlight, smashed and turned off. Around his body was a thin dust, similar to coal, but in it I noticed tracks. They led further down the corridor, but were too strange, too large to belong to a human. They were deep, as if something huge had pressed down on the floor. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt poisonous. I grabbed Martin's flashlight and ran back, not looking behind. Behind me, I heard something, not steps, but a sound like a soft rustling. It moved behind me, staying just at the edge of the light. My flashlight barely managed to snatch. When I returned to the hall, Sophie rushed towards me. Her face was pale as chalk, and her hands trembled. Carl stood up, his gaze heavy and empty. I tried to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could manage was, "Martin is dead." Carl said nothing. His face was stone-like. Sophie shrieked and covered her face with her hands. I didn't know what to do. It seemed as if the station itself was watching us, mocking our helplessness. We remained in the hall, surrounded by darkness, which had now become our constant companion. The steps were no longer heard. I thought Carl and I might be able to move Martin somewhere and prepare for transport, or somehow care for the deceased's body. But Carl, understanding my unspoken question, just shook his head and put a finger to his lips. calling for silence. I knew this was just the beginning. The silence that followed Martin's death was not just an absence of sound. It was something alive, breathing. It hung in the air, pressed on our chests, and crawled under our skin. We sat in the central hall, but none of us could feel safe. Even Carl, usually unflappable, looked tense. His hands rested on his knees, but his fingers twitched involuntarily from time to time. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, broken shadows on the walls. I found myself unable to look away from these shadows. They moved, although none of us stirred. Perhaps it was a trick of the light. But each time it seemed they got closer. Sophie sat in a corner, hugging her knees. Her eyes were empty, her gaze wandering around the room, settling on nothing specific. She looked as if she had been broken. Her breathing was barely audible, but I noticed her shoulders shaking. Carl finally stood up. His movements were abrupt, as if he was trying to shake off something. He approached the table and began to lay out the station's maps. His face was cold and focused, but I knew it was a mask. Something inside him was broken too, but he didn't want to show it. "We can't stay here," he finally said, his voice even but somehow hollow. "We need to move on." I wanted to object, to say that we should get out of here, that Martin's death was a warning, but the words stuck in my throat. I just nodded, understanding that arguing was futile. We left the central hall and headed deeper into the station. The corridors were endless, each meter looking the same. Dim lamplights, worn walls, traces of old rust. But the further we walked, the more I noticed something changing. The air became heavier, as if it had more oxygen than necessary, pressing on the lungs. Each breath was an effort, as if I was climbing a mountain. We reached a door labeled Technical Section 2. It looked old but was ajar, as if someone had passed through it before us. Carl paused in front of the door, listening to the silence. I saw his hand reach for the knife he carried on his belt. We entered. The room beyond the door was huge, almost like a hangar. The ceiling was lost in darkness, the walls covered in a thick layer of dirt and mold. In the middle stood massive metal structures, generators, long abandoned but still imposing. In the corner lay a pile of scattered tools, which looked as if someone had recently tried to use them. The light from our flashlights caught strange details. On one of the generators, I noticed traces. It looked as if someone had tried to climb up it, fleeing from something. I wanted to mention this, but I didn't dare. It seemed that any word could provoke something. Carl examined the room, methodically checking every corner. His movements were quick but cautious. I noticed his eyes linger on certain details, cracks in the floor, broken wires. Sometimes he muttered something quietly to himself, but the words were indistinct. Sophie stood next to me. Her flashlight trembled in her hands, but she kept shining it ahead, as if afraid that without light, the darkness would swallow her. Her breathing became rapid and choppy, and her eyes looked increasingly detached. I approached one of the tables, where torn folders with documents lay. Opening one, I noticed that the pages were covered in strange entries. They resembled records from a test site more than work notes. I quickly skimmed the entries, and phrases such as dark matter, quantum oscillations, anisotropy of topological defects, and something related to the energy supply to an entity simply referred to as the object appeared here and there. "Stop touching that." Carl's voice made me jump. I looked up and saw him staring at me. His face was tense, and his eyes gleamed in the flashlight's light. He stepped towards me and snatched the folder from my hands, then threw it on the floor. "We need to leave," he finally said. But before we could exit, a sound rang out. It was a metallic screech, so loud that I felt it in my bones. It came from somewhere above, from the ceiling. We all froze, lifting our flashlights. The light only caught rusty beams and cables, but the sound continued to intensify. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This was not just a sound. It was alive. It was approaching. Carl grabbed Sophie by the hand and pulled her towards the exit. "Hurry!" His voice was loud, but I heard fear in it. We ran, forgetting everything that was in the room. The sound chased us, echoing off the walls and multiplying, as if something huge was moving behind us, but we couldn't see it. As we finally burst out of the section, the door slammed shut behind us with such force that the floor trembled under our feet. Carl pressed against the wall, breathing heavily. Sophie collapsed to her knees, her face deathly pale. I turned back to look at the door. It seemed ordinary, but at that moment, it felt like something was behind it, something watching us. We didn't say a word to each other. We just silently continued down the corridor, not daring to look back. But I knew that the darkness was no longer just surrounding us. It was pursuing us. With each step, the darkness seemed to thicken. The corridors of the station grew longer, the walls closer, and the air heavier. We moved silently, our flashlights the only source of light. They illuminated walls covered in rust, worn pipes and cracks in the floor. But beyond the light, there was only dense, impenetrable darkness. Sophie led the way, her breathing becoming more labored. I could hear her steps quicken, as if she was trying to escape not only the station, but also her own fear. Carl brought up the rear, his face focused, but I noticed him glancing over his shoulder. It seemed he was listening for something we couldn't hear. My body felt like it was rebelling. Every cell screamed at me to stop, turn around and run away, but I kept moving. This fear, sticky and enveloping, was not ordinary. It felt like a cold, penetrating deep into the bones, making muscles tense from the strain. We entered another hall. This room was different from the others. There was less debris, and even the rust on the pipes seemed less noticeable. But that was precisely what was most alarming. This place looked too clean, as if someone had been maintaining it in such a condition. Sophie stopped, her flashlight trembling in her hand. I saw her staring at tracks on the floor, her face white as chalk. Carl stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He said nothing, but I noticed his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. We moved on. Sophie kept looking back as if she felt someone following us. Her steps quickened, and soon she began to pull ahead. I wanted to call out to her, but I didn't get the chance. Her flashlight vanished around a corner. I froze, feeling everything inside me clench. "Sophie," I called out, but my voice echoed off the walls, dissolving into emptiness. Carl stepped forward quickly, his face contorted with anger and fear. "Back, Sophie! Immediately!" he yelled, but there was no reply. We ran. The corridor seemed endless. Our steps sounded dull, like beats on an empty metal drum. The lights of our flashlights swung from side to side, catching only fragments of walls and ceiling. Then we heard her scream. It was not just any scream. It was a sound full of terror and pain that made me stop in my tracks. The scream came from ahead, and I felt my heart clench with fear. We reached another hall, nearly knocking each other over as we ran. Our flashlights swung across the walls, casting long, broken shadows. The air was strange here, thick, saturated with the smell of dampness and something chemical that stung the nostrils. The hall was vast, its dimensions lost in the darkness, but my eyes immediately landed on what was in the middle. Sophie lay on the floor. I froze, the flashlight in my hand, trembling. The light caught her body, but something about the scene was so wrong that I didn't immediately understand what I was seeing. Her figure was contorted, as if her body was subjected to some external pressure that defied the laws of physics. Her ribcage was arched upwards, her arms unnaturally bent, as though they had struggled against something, but lost. Her head was turned to the side, and her hair stuck to the floor in a pool of thick, dark liquid. I slowly approached, my legs shaky, my heart pounding as if trying to break free. Her eyes were open, but they weren't empty like Martin's. They held something more than fear, agonizing reflections of her last moments. Unimaginable. Her pupils were dilated, her lips slightly parted as if she had tried to scream, but no sound had come out. As I drew closer, the flashlight illuminated her chest. Dark lines were visible on her skin, as if the vessels beneath had burst, forming a strange pattern. They resembled a network, burned from within. It didn't look like the marks of an injury. It looked like the trace of something alien's presence. Her hands were clenched into fists, her nails broken and covered with blood, and black dust remained on the tips of her fingers. I noticed something lodged under her nails, but couldn't make out exactly what it was. It wasn't just dust. It was something shiny, resembling tiny crystals. The floor around her was strange. Dust had settled in a perfectly even circle around the body, as if someone had blown it away. Beyond this circle, deep scratches spread out in different directions. They looked as if something had slid across the concrete, rotating around her. "Damn," slipped out of me. Carl approached, but not too closely. His face was grim, his eyes downcast as if he didn't want to see what was happening. He glanced at Sophie's body and immediately turned away, clutching his head. "What really is happening here?" he muttered. I stood up, trying to breathe, but the air in the hall was getting heavier. My attention was drawn to something lying next to Sophie's hand, a piece of metal. It looked strange, covered in cracks, as if someone had tried to melt it, but it wasn't rust. It was a crust, like that of solidified lava. Burned lines, similar to those that had appeared on her skin, were visible on its surface. I reached for the piece, but as my fingers barely touched it, Sophie's body jerked. I jumped back, dropping the flashlight. Carl rushed to me, grabbing my arm. "Don't touch her. Don't go near," he shouted, and his voice echoed throughout the hall. I stood up, struggling to pick up the flashlight. Sophie's body didn't move again, but I saw a thin mist rising from her chest. It evaporated, disappearing into the air, but its smell lingered. Acrid, bitter, nauseating. Carl bent down, his face stone-like, but I saw his hands tremble slightly. He quickly examined Sophie's body but said nothing. He just straightened up, slowly scanning the hall. I couldn't take my eyes off her face. It was a fear indescribable in words. Something had destroyed her, not just physically, but psychologically. Carl grabbed my shoulder. "We can't stay here. We need to move." His voice was firm, but there was no certainty in it. "We can't just leave her here," I finally managed to say. "She's dead." Carl looked at me, his eyes as cold as ice. "If we stay, we'll be next." I turned away. My gaze fell on her notebook, which lay next to her hand. I picked it up and threw it in my backpack without looking at what was written. It was the last thing left of her, and I couldn't leave it behind. Carl tugged on my shoulder. "We need to go." His voice was firm but shaky. "Now." I didn't want to leave her there. My heart was torn apart by horror and guilt, but I knew that if I stayed, I would die. I slowly backed away, and the light of the flashlight no longer touched her figure. As we ran towards the exit, it seemed I could still hear her breathing, or maybe it was something else. There were tracks around her on the floor. They looked as if someone or something had stood next to her. The tracks were strange, not human, but not animal either. Each imprint was deeper than a normal human step and led toward the wall, where a ventilation shaft began. We left her body in that hall. I didn't want to, but we had no other choice. We left, and silence came again, but this silence was no longer empty. It followed us, breathing down our necks. The darkness in the new space seemed even denser. The light from our flashlights seemed to get lost in it, but we continued to walk, because staying put was even scarier. Carl moved forward with mechanical determination, his flashlight beam darting across the walls, paying no attention to details. His steps were quick and purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was leading us. I felt he was hiding something important, but I didn't dare ask. The deaths of Martin and Sophie hung between us like an unspoken truth, making us strangers to each other. Our flashlights picked out new details of the station from the darkness. Everything seemed even more abandoned here. Rusty pipes covered in streaks, walls cracked and leaking water, but amidst the chaos, there was something out of place. Periodically, I noticed tracks on the floor or walls that couldn't have been left by us. These were human tracks. Here they walked, there they stopped, and there they ran in different directions. Then the tracks ended abruptly. It seemed we were not the first team abandoned to this station. We approached a massive door with no sign on it. The metal looked almost untouched by time, only slightly covered with patina. Carl stopped in front of it, his hands touching the cold surface. He paused as if gathering his thoughts. "What's behind this?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. Carl didn't answer. Instead, he put all his effort into opening the door. It gave way with a painful creak, so loud that my ears popped. Beyond the door awaited something entirely different. The room was enormous, its dimensions impossible to determine due to the darkness. The ceiling was so high that our flashlight beams couldn't reach it. The floor was smooth, covered with a thick layer of coal dust that seemed to move with each of our steps. And in the center of this hall stood something. It was a stone, medium-sized, black, matte, and rough. Inside it seemed to contain something else, something moving like a clump of plasma. At first glance it appeared motionless, but upon closer inspection, I could swear the lines on its surface were moving. This movement was so slow, it was more felt than seen. Carl approached. His movements were slow, almost reverent. He reached out to the monolith, and at that moment, I felt the air change. A chill pierced me to the bones, causing me to inhale sharply. The flashlight in my hand flickered. "Carl, stop!" I called out hoarsely, but he either didn't hear me or chose to ignore it. His fingers touched the surface of the monolith. A moment later, the entire room filled with sound. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the monolith itself. It penetrated the chest, making the heart beat in rhythm. I felt the floor beneath our feet begin to tremble, and the air filled with an electric charge. Carl froze, his hand still touching the monolith, his face contorted, eyes wide open, not in fear, but something else, ecstasy or pain. I couldn't tell. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I took a step back, and at that moment, the light from my flashlight finally went out. The hall plunged into absolute darkness, engulfing me in panic. The hum grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere, filling the space. I tried to turn on my flashlight to no avail. Then I groped for Carl, trying to pull him away from the monolith. His body was rigid, as if all his muscles had tensed at once, but instead of retreating, he stepped forward. The light suddenly returned, but it was different. It wasn't from our flashlights. It emanated from the monolith, a faint cold glow that slowly pulsed, causing the shadows on the walls to move as if alive. I saw Carl fall to his knees, his fists clenched, then drop to the floor. "Carl!" I shouted, but he did not respond. The shadows moved faster, forming strange patterns on the walls. I felt something approaching, not a physical sensation, but an intuitive one. I knew we needed to run. I grabbed Carl by the shoulder and pulled him back. His body was cold, but it yielded. He fell onto his back, and I saw his face. It was white as a corpse's, eyes wide open, but he was breathing. Wasting no time, I dragged him toward the exit. The hum began to fade, but the room filled with a new sound, a whisper. It wasn't a single voice, but many, blending into a cacophony, the words indistinct, but their tone ominous. When I pulled Carl to the door, his eyes began to come into focus. He slowly got to his feet, but said nothing. We ran into the corridor, slamming the door behind us. The whisper stayed inside, but I felt it still echoing in my head. Carl leaned against the wall, his breathing heavy. He looked at me, but his eyes were empty. I didn't know what he saw or what happened to him, but I knew one thing. He was not the same person who had entered the hall. "We need to go," I managed, trying to compose myself. Carl didn't respond, but followed me. The corridors again became long and endless. Although the whisper had been left behind, I knew it wouldn't let us go. We ran. Our steps echoed loudly through the metallic corridors, bouncing off the walls like the beats of a gigantic drum. The air around us became colder, and it felt as if the station itself was repelling us, compressing the space. The light from our flashlights trembled, as if it too feared extinction. Carl, still silent and pale, moved mechanically, as if his body was moving forward, but his mind remained back there with the monolith. The whisper that had followed us in the hall had not disappeared. It became quieter, but I knew it was still there, lingering at the edge of audibility, clinging to us. Every word I couldn't make out felt like a prick in my back. My own footsteps seemed foreign, as if someone else was moving with me. The station now seemed to have a life of its own. Rustles, scrapes, and knocks sounded from all around. Somewhere in the distance, a strange noise, a cross between a cry and a laugh, echoed, and I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was beginning to falter. The walls seemed to move, coming closer and then receding. Everything around was unstable, like in a nightmare. Suddenly, the light from our flashlights dimmed. Their beams no longer illuminated the walls, but dissolved into the thick darkness that swallowed everything around. My heart began to beat faster, and I glanced at Carl. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes shone with a strange, otherworldly fury. He looked straight ahead, oblivious to everything around. We entered a massive hall, one of the station's main hangars. Its dimensions were astounding. The ceiling disappeared into the darkness, and the walls were too far to be seen by the light of our flashlights. In the center of the hangar stood a huge cylindrical tank, which probably once held fuel or water. Now it was covered in rust, with scattered debris of pipes and equipment around it. I stopped to catch my breath, but a cold draft touched my face. It wasn't wind, it was something else. The air here felt thick, saturated with something invisible but palpable. I looked around, but saw nothing but the void. "Carl," I managed, trying to get his attention. He stopped but didn't turn around. His back was tense, his shoulders slightly trembling. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, although the answer seemed obvious. Carl remained silent. At that moment, I heard a scrape. It came from the right, near the wall, and sounded like metal being dragged across concrete. I turned my flashlight in that direction, but the light only caught an old ventilation grate, beyond which there was nothing. However, the sound didn't disappear. It grew louder, approaching. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Carl by the shoulder. His body was cold, but he moved with my tug. We ran toward the far exit, leading to another corridor. Footsteps and scraping now seemed to come from everywhere, as if the station had come alive, wanting to keep us. The corridors became narrower, and their walls were covered with strange spots resembling mold, but glowing with a faint greenish light. This light seemed alive, moving, following us like a predator. Carl suddenly stopped, his flashlight illuminating a narrow door with a sign reading, "Emergency Exit." The sign was covered in a layer of dirt, but the words were still legible. Near the door lay two bodies, apparently there for several weeks. It seemed they were our predecessors, who had made the same journey as us. I rushed to the door, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock looked old, but not broken. I turned to Carl. "Help me," I rasped, feeling fear tighten my throat. But Carl continued to stand, staring into the darkness. The whisper returned. Now it was louder, clearer, as if voices were right behind my back. I turned around, expecting to see something, but the corridor was empty. Only the shadows moved, and I realized they no longer obeyed the light of our flashlights. Carl suddenly sprang into action, pulling a metal bar from his backpack. He struck the lock several times, and the door finally gave way with a deafening crack. We tumbled out into another corridor, but this one was different. It was narrower, the walls covered with something sticky, and the smell was suffocating, like rotting metal. We ran through it, not stopping. The light from our flashlights began to flicker, and the whisper turned into loud bangs, as if someone was chasing us, smashing the walls and pipes. I didn't dare look back. Finally, we reached another door. This time it opened effortlessly. We ran outside into the cold night. The air was icy but clean. I breathed it in greedily, trying to recover. Carl stood next to me, leaning against the wall, his face still impassive. I turned back to the station. In its dark windows, our flashlights reflected, but I felt as if someone was watching us from inside. The whisper had subsided, but I sensed it was only temporary. Carl finally looked up. "We need to get as far away as possible," he said, and I saw fear replacing the emptiness in his eyes. We headed to the car. The station remained behind us, but I still felt its breath on my back. The car was where we had left it, the dirty body, dusty windshield, the headlights barely piercing the dense night. We stumbled out of the station's corridor, barely able to stand. The wind, icy and sharp, hit our faces, but it felt real, tangible. After what I had felt inside, this wind almost seemed like salvation. Carl moved mechanically. His steps were uneven, as if he was unaware of his surroundings. When we reached the car, he stopped and stood there, breathing heavily. I flung open the driver's door, my hands trembling. All I wanted was to drive as far away as possible, to never see that station again. "Carl, get in," I said, trying to sound firm, though my voice betrayed my fatigue. He didn't move. His gaze was fixed on some void. I wanted to approach him, but something inside me held back. That look, it was so alien that I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. "Carl, damn it, get in the car," I repeated, but the words hung in the frosty air. He slowly turned his head towards me. His eyes, once lively, filled with determination, were now empty, as if the darkness of the station had swallowed them whole. I stepped back, feeling icy fear gripping my body. This was not the Carl I knew. "You're not Carl," I blurted out before I could stop myself. He moved. I didn't understand what was happening. His body lunged forward with inhuman strength, and I was on the ground, his hands clamped around my throat like iron vices. His face was too close. I saw cracks on his lips, from which some overly viscous saliva dripped. He was growling something, but the sound was indistinct. It was that same whisper that had followed us at the station. I struggled, trying desperately to break free, but his grip was unbelievable. The ground beneath me was cold and hard. Every movement caused pain. My hands found something nearby, a metal rod left on the ground. I gathered my last strength and struck Carl on the head. His body staggered, but the grip didn't loosen. He loomed over me again, and I saw his eyes. They were not human eyes. They were black holes absorbing everything around. His whisper grew louder, his grip stronger. I struck again and again. On the third hit, his body fell to the ground. I rolled over, crawling away as his hands twitched like a marionette's before stilling. But his eyes still stared at me. I picked up the rod and struck one more time, not in defense, but in fear, in desperation. When I realized Carl was no longer moving, I slowly stood up. The rod dropped from my hands with a dull thud. I stood over his body, feeling torn inside. This was not Carl, or was it? I got into the car. My hands trembled so badly that I could barely start the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, but I felt it was still there. The darkness watched. The car slowly rolled down the road, leaving the station behind, but I felt its breath on the back of my neck. It was cold in the police station. Not because of the temperature, but because of the atmosphere. The interrogation room was lit by a single dim lamp, creating more shadows than light. The detective sitting across from me, a man with sharp features and impassive gray eyes, rested his hands on the table, fingers gripping a folder of documents. "Tell me again," he said, his voice as even as a teacher questioning a student. "What happened at the station?" I recounted everything, about Martin, about Sophie, about the monolith, about Carl. I told him how he attacked me, how I defended myself, how everything went wrong. My voice trembled, but I held it together. I was telling the truth, every word. When I finished, he slowly exhaled and opened the folder. He was silent for a few seconds, looking at the papers. Then his eyes lifted to meet mine. "There were no bodies of Martin and Sophie at the station," he stated. Those words sounded cold, like a gunshot. I froze. "What do you mean there were no bodies? They died there. Martin, we found him in the corridor. Sophie, I saw her. Something killed her. We only found Carl's body. It seems he had an unfortunate fall," he interrupted. His voice became even more impassive. "No other traces. No evidence that Martin and Sophie were even there." "No, that's impossible. You missed something, or someone..." My breath quickened, and I felt panic grip me. "Someone is trying to cover this up. Don't you understand? There was something there. The monolith. It did something to Carl." "The monolith?" The investigator raised an eyebrow. His tone could be mistaken for mockery. "We found nothing to substantiate your claims. The station has been closed for a long time. It's just an abandoned building. Dust, rust, mold, and you..." He paused, looking me up and down as if diagnosing a patient. "We're under severe stress. Hallucinations in such conditions are not uncommon." "You don't believe me?" I asked, feeling torn inside. "Your behavior, your condition, it all suggests you lost control," he replied. "Perhaps you truly believe what you're telling, but the facts suggest otherwise. The only thing we know for sure, you killed Carl. It's been deemed self-defense. But your story, to put it mildly, it sounds incredible." The investigator paused, stubbed out his cigarette forcefully in the ashtray, leaned forward slightly, and looking me squarely in the eye said, "If you continue to insist on your version of events, you will be sent to a special medical institution. We're talking about a psychiatric hospital, and I think, permanently. They want to..." I started, looking into his cold eyes, but then hesitated. A thought flashed through my mind. Someone covered up the tracks. They want to hide what was there. The police are likely in the pocket of some corporation. The investigator leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "You need rest. Your mind is obviously trying to cope with the harsh conditions of the job. You need to find a hobby, like painting Warhammer figurines." His words sounded calm, but they hit like a blow. I felt fear turn to despair. No one would believe me. Everything I knew, everything I had gone through, turned to dust. As I left the station, the world around seemed different. People on the street moved like shadows. Their faces were blurred, as if they were not real people, but images printed on old, worn film. I walked but did not feel my steps. The voices of passers-by sounded like whispers, that same whisper. Months passed. I tried to return to normal life, but it was no longer normal. I felt the station pulling me back. Its shadows never left me. Sometimes I woke up at night and saw Carl, his face, his eyes. Sometimes I heard the whisper, quiet but persistent. At one point, I pieced together all the events and snippets of phrases from the reports I had seen at the station and concluded that experiments with dark matter, which makes up most of the mass of the universe, were being conducted there. What does this dark matter hide? Could it be that I had encountered one of these hidden worlds at the station? I no longer sleep in the dark. The light is always on, but I know that one day it will go out. A moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.